everybody, it's your pal Ron Howard from xTreme Sequences, bringing you Monday Minutes. What computer should you buy? You're on the fence. You hear all these rumblings about Mac and all the greatness that it does, and then you hear all the Windows people go, no, don't go Mac, don't do that, that's evil. And, you know, I made the change. I'm a Windows guy. I've always been a Windows guy. I've worked on Windows servers. I'm a Microsoft certified systems. I'm a Microsoft certified systems engineer from 2000, which means nothing today, nothing. But it has given me some foundation for networking and working on computers. And I've always built most of my own computers. And I've done this because I'm always trying to squeeze every ounce out of them I can, specifically for xLights, because I make a living sequencing and helping people in the world of holiday lighting. So I need something really fast. If I'm going to be stuck here in this chair, in front of these monitors, at this desk for 6, 7, 8, 10 hours at a time, well, I need to make the best use of it. And I know I've gotten a little flack. People seem to think I'm a Mac fanboy. Android, Samsung. I have no apparatuses on me that are made by Apple. Heck, even my earbuds, Sony. I have no Apple here. The only Apple I have is my laptop, and it's going to be replaced soon. I'm getting a Mac Studio. Why am I getting a Mac Studio? Well, long story short, it has the M2 chip, which I'm hoping will be even better. So let's get back to what this whole video is about. I'm not here to convince you to buy Mac or Windows. I'm here to shed some light on the real differences between the two platforms as it relates to xLights. That's all this is about. And there'll be some tips and tricks in here how to manage from both sides. I'll also leave links of the various components I used that I needed to add to my MacBook Pro because it's a laptop to make this all work. And with the Studio, I'm going to get, I'll be able to eliminate some of those, but I'll put all those links in the bottom. And a lot of these things I'm putting in the bottom for you to check out work with Windows just as well. Hubs and docks and things like that. They're really, really brilliant. But here's the best part for you. I'm not going to deliver this content. Mr. Con Blackett is going to deliver this content. He's a lovely chap from England, and he does this presentation. I saw him do it last year, and this year we co-facilitated at one of our group meetings. I don't know if many of you know, but I started, along with Jim Ennis, the European Lighting Fanatics group over 4 years ago to help train enthusiasts throughout Europe in this holiday lighting endeavor we call special. And it is special. And I've enjoyed the heck out of it. And it's been lovely watching these people develop their own skill sets. And I couldn't be more proud. So the reason I want to share what we recorded yesterday is Con just does such an amazing job humanizing this content to really help you understand why is it the Mac chipset does what it does so well with xLights and everything else for that matter. But I didn't want it to come from my lips. I wanted you to hear it from somebody else with a more extensive background in computing to shed some light on the subject. So please enjoy. Con, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Ron. I'll just for people who don't know, I mean, my background is system and network admin for quite a long time. I first got involved in the 70s and went out to the States for a few years installing networks and systems. So what I'm going to do today, what I'm going to do today is try and explain things right from the very basics right through to some more of the advanced stuff. So hopefully it should give you all a little bit of interest in, in parts of it at least. So with that, I shall hopefully switch over to sharing a screen. So can you see that slide on the screen, people?
Yes.
Yep, good. Okay, so what we're going to cover then is xLights and the computer side of xLights, as from the ultra basics to the advanced. But basically, as we all know, xLights is just a computer to sequence flashy lights. But it's useful to understand some of the simple stuff, like what's the relationship between CPU and RAM and storage as it relates to xLights. So all this is going to be tweaked towards xLights. So again, I'll talk about multi-core computers, but again, from an xLights perspective. And then to keep Ron happy, we'll talk about what's all the fuss about M1 and M2 chips. So that's the first part of what I'm going to talk about. The second bit is when things go wrong. So what are the basic tests you can do to see what's going wrong on your system? So if your computer starts to slow down, what things can you look for? What can you do to try and not only find out what's wrong, but to remedy it? And if you're stuck with Windows PCs, sorry about this, Ron, but how to improve your Windows PC. There's some very specific things I'll talk about towards the end that you can do if you're coming from a Windows background. And then also, more generically, things you can do on your PC just before a show. So it's a bit of proactive things you can do just before you're actually going to run a show. If you're going to be doing it from your PC, or you're going to be doing a lot of work on xLights. Most of you are going to be using FPP to actually run the show, but I'll explain that as we go along a little bit later on. And then I'll talk a little bit about some recommendations for xLights settings before we go on to Ron's bit. And then the last bit, I'll give you my recommendations, and it's my personal opinion, if you like. So you can take a look at the bucket of salt of what you should think about buying, depending on your price range and what you actually want out of it. So that's what we're going to cover in my set of the thing. So we'll start off with talking a little bit about computers. So computers have been around for a long time. They've been around for over 1,000 years, but computers as we know them really only came into, this was the first one that was ever born. It was a computer called Colossus, invented in 1943 for a specific task, but it's still a computer that we could relate to today. It's got storage, which these tape systems here, it got memory, it got, a lot of the things that we know today, except this thing weighed 2 tons and it was probably as powerful as as a pencil in compared to modern computers. But they've been around for a while. But the interesting thing of this particular computer, if you like, is it was actually developed. Something my little hobby horse is I've come from a maintenance point of view and from a practicality point of view rather from a theoretical point of view. And the guy actually who built the first computer, he was a very practical guy but had very little theory. And in fact, he was told by the guys who knew all the theory that it couldn't be done because it used something called valves. And they said if you got more than 6 or 7 valves, it's going to break down every few seconds. And this thing needed 1,500 valves to actually work. But because he got the knowledge and the background, not from a theoretical point of view, but like we have in experimental background, he knew that it could be built. So he actually used his own money, went away and built the thing. And it helped shorten the war by, I think, about a year. Amazing bit of kit. And that was the first flashy lights. I mean, this is the very basics of what you got in 1943. Not exactly pixels, but what you had is lamps behind coloured bulbs. I mean, these weren't flashing for a display. They were flashing because they were actually showing the progress of decrypting German transmissions. And it's not the one you've seen on TV. This was actually a thing's called the Lorenz cipher, which was actually Hitler talking to his generals. It was a much higher level. But the UK actually were decoding that just before the end of the war. And it actually shortened the war mainly because they could see what Hitler was telling his generals. When it come to D-Day, they actually used this computer to decrypt what Hitler was telling his generals to do in terms of where the Brits were and the Americans were going to land in either, the defense, so they were going to land in Calais, not Normandy. But that's, but it was around, I say. And so, but the principles of that was, if you like, the very birth of electronic computing. And so the modern day principles still arrive. There's still something called storage. There's still something called the CPU, and there's still something called RAM. And that's the guts of what I'm going to go into today. So I'm going to talk about what CPU is, what RAM is, and what storage is, because we all have seen them. We all know what they physically look like. But a lot of people get a little bit confused into when you need more storage or when you need more RAM or when you need more CPU. So I'm hopefully going to try and make that simplified. So to simplify, I'm going to give you Janet and John's version of what they all are. So in a very simple term, a CPU, I like to use analogies. And the analogy I like to use for this one is a CPU. If you think of it as an alien, it's a beast that's that's got no sense, but it can calculate things really, really quickly. So it's not like a human being, it's got a very limited amount of things it can do, but it can do them really quick. So you imagine this alien is a fantastic calculator, but by itself, it doesn't do an awful lot. So what it needs to be able to, when it does its calculations, it needs to be used, in my analogy here, it needs to use a whiteboard. So when it's jotting its calculation, it's going to do a load of calculations, work out what things are and where they're going, and store that information. And the analogy is it uses a whiteboard. So if you think of RAM as your whiteboard, the calculator as the CPU, and then once you switch your computer on, the alien, as I say, it's a dumb alien, but it's given a set of instructions as it boots up. So as it boots up, it gets a set of instructions. You then run something like xLights, in this case, the calculator or the computer, the CPU part of it, uses that information to do something, but in doing so, it needs that RAM to actually store temporary information. So when somebody says, for example, if you put more RAM into a computer, you'll get a faster computer, that's not strictly true, as I'll explain a little bit later on. And if it runs out of space in RAM, so the whiteboard gets full, if you like, so the RAM is a finite size, whether it's be 4 gigabyte, 8 gigabyte, 16 gigabyte, 32, it doesn't matter what it is. But if eventually you run out of RAM, that's the point where things can not speed up, but slow down. Because say you've got, an example, say you've got 4 gigabytes of RAM, and your little alien here runs out of room on his whiteboard, that information gets copied onto the slower file storage. And we know that in our terms as being like hard drives or SSD drives. But compared to RAM, which is very fast, it's quite slow in comparison. So if your little alien here is doing a load of calculations and he runs out of whiteboard space, he has to then get that information from, and I've used a quill and pen and paper as an analogy, but he has to get that information and put it onto there. So the overall system, i.e. the computer, the RAM and the storage, slows down. So if somebody tells you your computer's running slow because it's swapping out or paging out, that's the essence of why. It's because you've run out of whiteboard and you're having to put things onto pen and paper. So I said the instructions, so things like xLights, they come into the alien. The alien does all the temporary calculations on the whiteboard, uses swap if necessary, but then stores that information. So where you've got things like, FSCQ file, all the rest of it, they're stored on that, again, that file storage. It's slow, but the advantage to that is it's, apart from it being slow, it's what they call non-volatile, which means when you turn the computer off, it's still there when you came back. The problem with RAM, random access memory, is it's, as soon as you turn the PC off, it's gone. It only exists. That's why I like to think of it as a whiteboard. Imagine it's a whiteboard that when the power goes off, it just rubs itself out. So they're if you like, the building blocks. You've got your CPU. I mean, there are other things as well, but you've got your CPU, you've got RAM, and you've got storage. And modern computers, typically nowadays, we have multiple CPUs. So you can have, 4 cores, you can have multiple cores and multiple threads of CPUs. And you can think of them as individual aliens, if you like. So ideally, that sounds great, because if you've got something complex to do, you want to do it fast, looking at that, you think, well, that's great, because it'll do it 4 times as fast, because the CPU is generally the bottleneck of speed. But the problem we've got with, and that does work to an extent, but the problem we've got with things like xLights is it doesn't really access all the CPUs efficiently. So xLights is written in a very efficient bit of code called C++, and it uses a Windows widget called XW widgets. Sorry about knocking the microphone over. But in reality, it's not getting the most out of all the CPUs. So if somebody says to you, well, just buy a PC with extra CPUs, yeah, it's good for certain things, but not for everything. And in an xLight environment, it doesn't make a massive difference. It doesn't give you 4 times the speed or twice the speed. And again, that's something to be aware of, is that generally speaking, extra CPUs are good, but you need a program like xLights that will make the most of those extra CPU threads or cores. And so you get things like DaVinci Resolve for doing, loads of good stuff with video, and they can make very good, they're written specifically for that type of environment where they'll heavily use all the cores in a computer. But for our purposes, although it does give you a bit of advantage, having extra CPUs doesn't make a massive difference to speed. Right, the other thing which Ron related to earlier on, which is about power, heat generated by these damn things, is that CPUs, when they run at a high, say you're running a CPU at 80, 90%, that little alien gets quite hot. And so it will use a lot of, in this case, I've shown it's a battery, it will use a lot of power to do what it's trying to do. So if you've got a small CPU, you need a little bit of a fan and it generates a little bit of heat. If you get a bigger CPU, the problem you've got then is that bigger CPU needs more cooling, needs more fans or faster speeds, and uses more power. So you're using the battery power or using the mains power if it's a desktop, but you need cooling then to keep it cool, because otherwise the CPU basically gets too hot to function properly. So that's the relationship. And the standard computers that you see in a Windows PC and in Macs before the M1 chip came out is called an x86 chip. And the bigger it needs to be, the more power it uses. But there's a couple of years ago when the first of the new architecture came out, everybody calls it Mac Silicon now these days. Basically, it's an idea that's been around. It's called ARM. So rather than being an x86 architecture, it's what they call an ARM architecture. And in simple terms, trying to simplify that, what it means is it uses the alien itself uses a simpler way of doing things. It's called a reduced instruction set, if you're really interested. But basically, they see little alien, although he's doing things really fast, he's not having to do as complicated of things. And that means that he doesn't generate as much heat. And because he doesn't generate as much heat, and he doesn't need as much power. So if you look at your FPP, if you look at a Raspberry Pi, that also uses an ARM architecture as opposed to an x86 architecture. So, and to give you a typical example, a computer that typically in a x86 environment, you'd need 65 watts to drive that little alien CPU. In an ARM architecture, and again, these are just typical values, that could be as low as 5 watts. So you're using a hell of a lot less power. And so you generate a lot less heat. And it makes the thing more efficient, which is why I bought the very first Mac M1 laptop, because it didn't need a fan, because the thing runs, even when I'm giving it even I'm doing a bit of 4K video editing, it doesn't generate much heat. So the batteries last longer, but for me, the important things for a laptop is that it doesn't get hot. My old laptop used to be like having a hot water bottle on your knee. It was a bit of a pain. So that was the massive difference for the M1 chip. It moved away from being Intel x86 to being ARM, and ARM's been around for a long time. But to be fair, the Apple, as much, and I used to hate, like most of you on this call, I used to hate Apple with a vengeance. I mean, I had an infrastructure of 100,000 PCs was my bread and butter, and I wouldn't have Macs in my environment because they were just massively overpriced for the same performance value. But the M1 chip, in my opinion, changed all that a few years ago when it first came out. So I bought one of the very first ones, and it's, as I'll explain later, it's changed it on its head. Whereas at one time, Apple was the stupid choice in terms of price performance. The M1 and the M2 have now, if you've got 650 or more quid to spare, you'd be crazy to go the Intel route, in my opinion. And I'll explain more about that later. Right, and again, one of the other reasons people like there were more things done than just being an ARM architecture. And I'll go into a little bit of that on here, not in too much detail. But Ron, as I say, loves the M1, M2 purely because it's a great machine. In comparison, if you use them side by side, the difference is night and day. And one of the reasons for that is the fact that And it's an Achilles heel to a certain extent, is it use something called system on a chip, which means your RAM and your CPU and your GPU, which is the graphical side of things, they all sit on a single physical chip, which is great in some respects. It's great because it's efficient, and if you like, the amount of time it takes to transfer stuff from RAM into the GPU and all the rest of it, it's very efficient and gives it another leg up. Not as much as the ARM processor, but it's an extra bit of a leg up. The downside is that when you buy one of these things, you can't do what you used to do in the old days, buy 8 gig of RAM and then put another 8 gig in at a later point. Because it's all on one chip, you've got to decide before you buy the thing, am I going to buy an 8 gig one, 16 gig one, etc. You can't upgrade it at a future point. You've got what you've got. But there are some other little tweaky good things about it. I talked earlier on about multiple CPUs. It does try to do a little bit of clever parallel processing of the CPU. So even for things like xLights, it will make basically generally there are in the standard one, there's 8 CPUs inside the M1, and it will try and make more use of those CPUs by doing something called out of order execution. I'll not bore you with the details of it, but basically it's a way of not true parallel running, but it gives you again a little bit of an improvement. And so there are all these things added together, plus the fact that obviously it uses decent SSD rather than the old-fashioned hard drives, mechanical hard drives, so that the end result is, if you can afford it, the M1 chip in Apple has become bizarrely better value for money, in my opinion, than anything you can get in Intel. And that's something that I would never thought I would have said about 3 years ago. As I say, my background is, I was installing Windows 3.1 and stuff in late 80s, early 90s. It's and I would have fought hard to keep Macs out of the environment for a long, long time. But things change, and it's a big change. Right, so hopefully that's given you an idea of the relationship between RAM and CPU and storage. But then the thing to do is when things go wrong. So imagine you've spec your machine out, but then say you're running xLights, for example, and things start to go wrong, and you want to find out what's gone wrong. Then there are both on the Mac, there's a thing called Activity Monitor, and on the PC, there's a thing called Task Manager. And they both do very, very similar things. I've just done screenshots of the Activity Monitor, but if you look at Task Manager, it more or less does the same thing. But it's both are very useful utility, or it's really useful for utility for fault finding, because what you can do, you can run the thing up and you can then look at things like in this particular case, I can see that xLights here, if you can see my mouse going around, that's using up 45% of the CPU. But don't get too hung up by that, because that's only one of the CPUs. If the key thing if you're using Activity Monitor, the key thing you want to be looking on in this screen is this figure down here where it says idle 84.29. That means that's how much CPU's not used. So even though you've got 8 CPUs in this particular case, even though xLights might be running 90% of the CPU on one CPU, the thing to do is look at, from a machine perspective, is to look at that idle value down there. And again, you can look at the graph, but that idle value for CPU usage is a pretty good indication. The other thing is if you get something go wrong, so for example, you get a certain bug in xLights that causes some kind of memory crash or whatever, and it locks the thing up, you might see that CPU jump up to 100%. So again, it's a useful utility to spot when things go wrong. And again, you can see, for example, xLights is using 45%, whereas Tabby, which is a terminal emulator, is only using 3%. You can get a pretty good idea of what things are using what. And so that's the CPU. And then the other one, which is even probably more useful, is memory. So the same utilities, and again, this is the same for both Windows and Macs, and even Linux. On Linux, it's a thing called Top, but they all do more or less the same thing. But on here, we're looking at memory usage. So I've deliberately created a sequence that uses a video as part of the xLights sequence. And so it ramps up to 4.16 gigabytes of memory. So I've got an 8 gig machine here, and it's using quite a bit of memory. And I've deliberately done that. Normally, a sequence you might see might have 1 gigabyte at most used, but because I've got a sequence there that includes a video that I've not particularly spent a lot of time optimizing, it uses up quite a lot of that memory. And these are 2 shots of the same thing down here. Again, on this screen, the things you can do are look at what's using up all the memory. And so if you've got things like example Keynote, which is this, you can because it's a shared resource. So if you've got loads of things here, you can see what else is a good idea to get rid of. So I've got WhatsApp, I can see, for example. So if I was having trouble with xLights, I'd just go and shut WhatsApp down, for example, which gives me that extra little bit of free memory. But again, you'll hear people talk about memory pressure, particularly when it comes to Macs. And what you've got to look for there is a nice simple screen here, in that the bottom one is actually showing these are 2 separate screens. I've just cut and pasted that bit off. But if it shows green like that, so that means it's behaving itself quite happily and everything's going along lovely. If it starts to go yellow, like a mustardy yellow, then it's doing a bit of work, but it's not the end of the world. Again, just for the more advanced side of things, if you look at physical memory, it's got 8 gigs of memory there, and it says it's used 7, which you might think, oh God, that's getting a bit close. But what it does, these operating systems nowadays are a bit cleverer than that, in that if there's any free memory, they'll use it for other things. So automatically, if you look, nearly 1 gig of that used is actually a thing called cache files. Excuse me, I've got a quick drink. And without going into too much detail, what that does is it acts as a way of speeding up access to your SSD drive. So even though it looks bad because you're using 7 gig, you're actually only using 6 gig. So it's the easy way of looking at this one is almost to forget those figures. Look at the colors. And if it gets really bad, you'll see that go red, or you'll see peaks of red. And again, similar to what we looked at before, if you can see that xLights is the problem there. But if you've got other things that you want to, like, for example, WhatsApp, you can close other things down. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So they're the 2 most useful. I say it's they both look very, very similar. This is from a Mac, but the Windows one, if you go into Task Manager on the Windows one, it's more or less the same. Not a lot of difference. The memory management on the Macs is a little bit better, but it's more or less telling you the same things. And in fact, it's more important to look at those if you've got a Windows machine, because Windows doesn't have, because of the way the operating system works, and this is before the M1 chip even, it's not quite it's a little bit more temperamental to over usage of memory. So as I say, if you use nothing else, they're the 2 things I would use if I wanted to find out what's going wrong. And you can do clever things like, as I say, this one I can see my xLights is using 4.16 gig of memory. What I can do, and I know why that is, because I've got a video going off in there, but I can then go in with that for that video. I can use Handbrake to lower the resolution of the video, then run xLights again, and I can see, it's gone down to 3.16 or 3.25. You can use it, if you're really clever, you can use it to do a bit of fine tuning, which is not a bad thing, because then when you copy the .fscq files across to your to your Raspberry Pi, it's going to be, that video is going to have less impact on that. So it's a bit more of an advanced subject, but it can be used to actually help you get the system more efficient before you then do a batch transfer across onto your FPP system. Okay, right. So the basic things for fault finding, just to recap, are the task manager or activity manager, but there are other things you can do as well. So if you've got, for example, a PC that's getting a bit long in the tooth, you can, in Windows, you can run something called check disk, and you can look for errors on there. Because the other thing I've seen happen quite a lot is that I mentioned earlier on that the CPU, if it runs out of RAM, it will start swapping things out to the hard drive. If you start to run a hard drive, whether it's an SSD or it doesn't matter what it is, if you start running them at 85, 90% full, it then can't swap out effectively. And that can, so as daft as it sounds, if you have problems on a PC, for example, it's worth looking at how much free disk space you've got. And again, occasionally run the check disk utility, because that checks for errors on the disk. Because again, that can really lead you astray. It certainly led me astray a few times over the years, whereby the hard drives become a bit messed up because it's not quite, it's getting bad sectors, and so it starts to impact on the system crashing or just even performance. So if you've got, mainly if you've had it for 5 years or longer, run a check disk on it and check it all out. And again, there are similar utilities for the Mac. Not quite as important because the disk I/O system's a bit more advanced than it is on the Windows side of things. And then just for completeness, for Linux, it's things like top, free, and FSCK is equivalent to check disk, if you like, or you can use a little utility called gparted live. Whichever operating system you're on, the principles of what I talked about earlier on are more or less the same. There's not a lot of difference there. And again, check ideally, you've got, ideally more than 20% CPU free, but don't panic if it occasionally hits 100% CPU, apart from the fact it generates a bit of heat for that poor old Alien. It's not the end of the world if you're just hitting peaks of 100% and then dropping down again. It's only when you get sustained levels of 100% that it's bad. Similar with memory, look for swap used and make sure you've got at least 20%. And again, as I mentioned earlier, make sure you've at least 25% of your disk space free, so that if it does start to swap out and you're needing to do other things, then, that can have an impact as well. So I'd say by far and away, it's Task Manager and Activity Monitor, but also these are the other utilities that, I'd consider, I have had all those come up on me over the number of years. Right, so how to improve your Windows PC, and this page is really mainly for Windows. So big thing for Windows is you're going to get memory leaks, and so so the fix is, have you tried? And it's the old joke on the TV series, have you tried turning it on and off again? Because that will fix 99.9% of things. And if you get something, imagine our little aliens run out of, he gets confused and his program jams. If you turn him off and turn him back on again, it's like sending him to sleep, waking him up. And that will literally fix 99.9% of things. If it's still running slow, then if you've got Windows, and this is just purely Windows, this is not Linux or Mac, if it's more than 2 or 3 year old, then the only way generally I've found is to reset the PC, basically reinstall Windows. And you can do that a lot easier than you could in the bad old days, latest versions of Windows. It's a bit of a task, but it's, and I'm talking about something you do, every few years. But if you are, for example, if you dig an old computer out the cupboard and you want to run xLights on it, then I would strongly consider reinstalling Windows, because it does things. It cleans up the registry, gets rid of a load of bloatware, and it will give you, I've seen it give up to a 60% performance increase just by doing that. In fact, I've seen it give more than 60% if it's a really old machine. One of the things that I was never 100% happy about with Windows is it uses a thing called registry, and without going into too much detail, it's a stupid way of doing things. And the only way you can get things like crap cleaner and other stuff, but nothing works. The only real way of getting your registry clean again is to reinstall Windows. But thankfully, Microsoft have been a lot better in recent years, and it's not as, there's lots of tutorials out there on how to do it. It's not the task it used to be. It's a fairly trivial thing. I said, particularly if you've got a machine that you're going to drag out the cupboard and start using for xLights. And again, just a general thing, if it's possible, have a machine that's dedicated. If you're going to run xLights and you've got an old laptop that's halfway decent, and I will explain what I mean by that later, then dedicate that to your, because if you dedicate it to xLights and you don't do browsing the internet and getting all your email, you're less likely to get ransomware and all that kind of horrible stuff. So it's always a good idea, if possible, apply all the latest patches to it, run a good free virus checker. Don't, in my opinion, don't bother buying one, just use a free one. They're all pretty good. And periodically run something called malware bites, because even if you've got a good virus checker on there, they will get through. You know, as I said, I had an environment with 100,000 PCs once, and it was a bloody nightmare. But malware bites, and I'm a bit out of date these days because I don't use Windows myself these days. I use Linux or Macs, but periodically run malware bites because it will catch stuff that the virus checkers will let through. I mean, there's a footnote there. Back in 2001, the environment I did look after had a thing called a code red worm, and the reckon it cost the world at that time something like $4 billion or something stupid. And certainly the system I looked after, I got a call one Saturday afternoon saying that most of it, because I looked after BT, it was BT's intranet, and it basically took it took nearly half the BT's intranet down. So, you know, if that had been still in that state on Monday morning, they would have been hell to pay, to say the least. But yeah, so these things aren't a joke. You know, make sure you've got all the latest patches, do run good virus checkers, and do run malware bites. And again, as already mentioned, run check disk. You know, if you do get errors on check disk, again, a tip for you, you know, it might get you through a temporary thing, but if you do get proper errors on check disk, buy yourself a new SSD or a new hard drive, because it never lasts for long. It will go again and it will destroy it, you know. But at least it gives you a chance. If you find errors on check disk, at least it'll warn you that there's going to be problems, and it gives you a chance to back your systems up, get all your xLights sequences copied out of the way, and then, you know, get yourself a new storage drive and put it back on. Don't rely on check disk to actually fix things, because it might get you through a temporary thing, but in the end of the day, it's going to come back with a vengeance. Last on this one, if you've got an old PC and it's been, you know, it's starting to run a bit slower, a bit warm, you know, take the thing apart if it's a desktop PC and dust it out. Get some of that thing, just dust the heat sink out, because, you know, dust eventually does kill them. That little alien will just get too hot because his heat sink's not allowing him to cool down. And again, big difference. Just get a can of dust, you know, air spray, basically, just compressed air. You just spray it into, you know, dust goes everywhere, like, but at least it gets it out of the CPU heatsink. And just generally clean up the mother, you know, it doesn't really harm to clean the motherboard with air as well. It's designed for that use, so it's not going to damage the internals of the PC. Right, so that was specifically really aimed at Windows, but if you're thinking of in general terms, it's always a good idea, before you're going to do a load of xLights work, or if you're going to use xLights to run your show, it's always a good idea to power it all down, restart your computer, and make sure you've closed all other applications. Don't open up a load of browsers. You know, if you've got, you know, Thunderbird mail going, and you've got, you know, bloody Safari, or what, don't matter what it is, Chrome, anything. Chrome, all the browsers, for example, tend to use a lot of memory. So if you open up like 12 browsers of 12 tabs on a thing, you'll use up a lot of memory. So again, you know, give your xLights all the chance it needs to use all the resources it needs. So just shut the application down, you know, restart your computer. Don't launch your email. Don't launch your browser unless you really need to. Do some simple things, like if you've got FPP, just ping it from the command line and make sure you can actually contact all the bits you need to get in touch with. As I say, important thing, don't open up more. If you need a browser, open up just a single tab. Don't open up loads of tabs. You'd be amazed. In fact, if you look at that other utility we talked about with a memory one, and then just open up loads of tabs in any browser, you'll see how much memory it uses. It's a bit of a nightmare. Right, so these are recommendations. They're not my real recommendations. These are Nick from Keith Wesley off the net. But in xLights itself, set of preferences to run. If you go into preference sequences, turn off render on save, because it's turned on by default and it just slows things down. You don't really need it, because every time you're going to do something, you're going to save it anyhow. It's not really, particularly if you've got a slow machine. Some of these things are talking about, if you've got a machine like Ron's got, I mean, for God's sake, you don't need to do any of this. This is just trying to tweak around the edges, if you like. So again, on slow machines, turn render all off and then save it when needed. Big thing is if you're using videos, because I tend to do a lot of, I like now to have, I've got internal projectors, and I like to project my stuff onto a nice video screen, which is great. But as I say, it uses up a lot of CPU, and more importantly, uses a lot of memory. So again, can't reiterate this enough. Optimize your videos. You don't need, if you're projecting onto a projector screen, you don't need 4K projection. You need almost sub HD, and you can play around with that, as I mentioned, and look at how it affects xLight itself, because as I mentioned earlier, it's not just xLights as an application, it's also FPP. If you're going to put that onto FPP and it's doing a lot of video stuff, you're going to potentially slow it down. Another preference there is backups. Turn on backup folders, because as Ron's going to talk about in a bit, it's a good idea to have a nice, neat substructure of where you're going to put your videos, where you're going to put your music, and Ron will talk all about that in a minute. But if you make sure they're all backed up by default, by default they're on off, so that is an important one in my opinion. Good thing about xLights is it's tremendously well supported, and it's also backwardly compatible. So if you do have, if you get a new version of xLights and it's crashing on you, you can always drag back to an early release, go back one release ideally, and it's nearly always backwardly compatible. Ron might tell you differently, but I haven't certainly not come across a point where it's not being backwardly compatible. There might be one, but certainly my experience, it's been great. The guys who do the development on this really think things through. If you do run out of disk space, one thing you can do is go into preferences and purge your backups. By default, it stores it for so many X days. And so you can, if you're really, if you're at that point where you're using 80% of your disk, which we talked about earlier on, you can go in there and, set purging backups for days older than a certain period of time. And again, in sequences, you can go into tools, clean up locations. These things, a lot of these are tweaking things, and they're all really, good ideas, particularly the preferences to turn on backup for subfolders. I said Ron will probably tell you a lot more than I can tell you. This is just what I've picked up over my period in playing with it. But they are useful things, particularly if you've got a slowish machine. Right. So what computer do I, and this is the contentious bit, how long's a bit of string? What computer do I need for xLights? And things have changed over the years. If you've got a fairly small scale, less than 5,000 pixels and no video, then if you look at what CPU's in your computer, you can then go on a web page called benchmark this and put the CPU name, and it'll give it a figure, a number. And that number, the higher the number, the better. And the figure I've found is if that benchmark is over 2,000, then generally for most people, unless you're Ron or somebody who's doing a lot of xLight stuff, that's generally going to be enough. And again, as a generalism, 8 gig of RAM and an SSD of 240 gig or bigger, if you've got bigger, nothing wrong with that. Again, as I mentioned earlier on, if you've got the option and you've got an old mechanical hard drive in there and you can swap it out for an SSD drive, great, because if you do end up swapping, for example, that swap will be a lot faster to an SSD card than it will be to an old-fashioned mechanical magnetic drive. They're a hell of a lot faster. And so normally I would say to people, if you've got less than, if you've got money to burn, then it's different. But, and I say, so if you're going to go for small scale and you're not doing you're not going to be really hammering it like Ron does, you can, and you've got less than 600, say you've got, I don't know, 200 quid or whatever it is, then that's where I would push people in. And at that point, you're talking Windows. And Windows is great. There's nothing wrong with Windows. I mean, I'm not knocking it. But if you've got, my opinion is, if you've got a medium scale where you've got, you're going to do video and various other bits and pieces, then I would seriously start thinking, I mean, I put this last year's slide, but actually it's changed now. I would say if you can physically get hold of 650 quid, and you've got a monitor, and that's the key thing, monitor, keyboard and mouse, and you don't have to buy an Apple monitor, for God's sake, don't. But if you've got a decent, half-decent monitor, or a couple of monitors, even better, and you can afford 650 quid, then the Mac Mini with 8 gig of memory and the basic configuration is going to be, tremendously better than anything you can afford comparison wise with Intel. It's going to be faster, more reliable, just better all around, which is really bizarre. I never thought I'd say that a few years back. And obviously, if you're wrong, then you want a Mac Mini Studio. But one thing I should mention before I leave this bit is when we talked about RAM, remember, it's just a whiteboard. So if your applications only use 8 gig, then it's probably, to make it future-proof, it's probably a good idea to get 16 gig of memory. But to be honest, if you're going to go for 32 gig, unless you're doing something unless you're editing 8K videos or something stupid, it's not even, it's beyond future-proofing for most of us. If I was buying again, I mean, I've got an 8 gig, as I say, it's the original M1, and it's absolutely amazing, in my opinion. But if I was starting again and I was buying now, I would be tempted, if I got the money, I'd be tempted to go and get the Mac Mini, but I would get rather than the 8 gig of memory, I'd go for the 16, just to give me the future proof of it. You don't really need it, but it's nice to have that future proof bit. So that's my 2 penneth worth, if you like. The other thing, don't make the mistake I made. I went for one big, huge monitor. In reality, I think you're better off. My opinion now is if I was spending that same money again, I'd go for 2K monitors rather than one big 4K monitor. Because if you're using, this is for xLights specifically, because you can get the house preview in one, and you can do and Ron will talk you more about that and probably give you a better real feel. But bear in mind, this is my opinion. It's not set in stone, but this is my opinion. My opinion, as I say, so to recap that, if you've got less than 650 quid, for a couple hundred quid, you can probably find, or you might even find a PC in the cupboard somewhere. If it's got 8 gig of RAM and it'll have a benchmark of 2000, away you go. And it'll do a lot of, probably 80% of the people on this call, it'll probably do what you need it to do. Because don't forget, most of us are going to be actually, although we're going to be working on the sequence on the PC, for the actual show day, you're going to be running it on your FPP, which, of course, at that point, it doesn't really matter how much, how fast your PC is. But, as I say, that's my opinion of life, a life according to Con. So that's the end of my bit of the presentation. And one last thing. The other good thing I forgot to mention in last year's as well is that if you need to move it between a Windows machine and a Mac or Mac to Linux, it doesn't really matter, because all the if you like, the database where all the information for xLights is stored is all stored in something called text files. It's an open, if you look inside them, so you can copy, apart from the binaries that run it, you can install it, and then you can copy the subdirectories from a Linux machine onto a Mac and a Mac onto a PC and vice versa. They're all called XML files, which is extended markup language, which is a really clever thing that the developers did. And to be fair, these JSON or whatever, it's a really good way. But from your point of view, it means that you've got absolute lovely portability between whatever other operating system you use. So if you move from a Mac to Windows or Windows to Mac, it's a piece of cake. And with that, if I've not all sent you all to sleep, I shall pass you back to Ron.
Con, hats off. Brother, that was so good. So good. I always pick up a few more things from you when I watch you present. So hats off again. That was just marvelous. I really thank you for your time putting together that presentation and allowing me to share it with everybody in the community. I think this will really help people out. So again, thank you for that. I hope all of you enjoyed this. Again, this is Monday Minutes. I hope you have a great day. I hope you took a lot from this. Catch you later. See ya.